Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, June 9th, 2020, where two laypersons, a pastor and an academician, gather for about 55 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. This Sunday is June 14th, and each Tuesday we simply call in from wherever we may be, our homes, our travels, our hotels, at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year A. And if you're focusing on the Gospel this week or preparing for a virtual discussion group in the pandemic, we hope this will provide areas of focus and reflection. And here's our approach. We work independently in advance of the call-in with some preliminary information or questions on what the lead-off person on the call-in would like to discuss. We then develop perspectives and share, encourage, and challenge each other. After we read the text, Charles Willard will share some opening perspectives on what we call What Would They Have Heard? And this will help us consider the differences in authors, purposes of the writing, and the challenges of time and culture. And here are the individuals joining us on the call this morning. Charles Willard.
Bill Hall.
Sara.
Charles Willard, I see you, and Don Upton. And we'll kick things off this morning with a reading of the Scripture. So, Bill Hall, I want to turn to you first to get us started.
Okay. In a moment, we will read a somewhat lengthy passage. I will acknowledge it's a bit longer than some lectionaries provide, but for reasons that I hope will become clear, I think it's important that we hear the whole passage. And my colleagues are going to help me with this. We're going to divide it into 4 sections. But I think it was helpful to me as I reread the Gospel of Matthew several times this week to note as briefly as I can the context in which today's passage comes. A quick reminder. In the first 4 chapters of Matthew, Jesus' lineage is presented, his birth, the wise men, flight to Egypt, the return, the move to Nazareth. Jesus begins his adult ministry. John the Baptist baptizes him. There's a temptation in the wilderness. And then Jesus begins his ministry in Galilee. Chapters 5 through 7 are the teaching, the Sermon on the Mount. We're very familiar with that. And then in chapters 8 and 9, leading up to the place we're going to start toward the end of 9, there's one healing after another. A leper twice heals paralytics, heals Peter's mother of a fever, heals people with demons, and, quote, all those who were suffering, raises a ruler's daughter. On the way to do that, he encounters a woman with a years-long discharge of blood. He heals her, blind men, and finally a mute demoniac. And then comes the passage we're now going to read together, Matthew 9, verse 35 through the 10th chapter, the 23rd verse. This is the word of the Lord. Let us attend to this reading. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness. When Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest."
Then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits, to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, and also known as Peter, and his brother Andrew, James the son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Caesaric Cananaean, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed them.
These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, and cast out demons. You received without payment, give without payment. Take no gold or silver or copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics, or sandals, or staff, for laborers deserve their food. Whatever town or village you enter, find out who in it is worthy, and stay there until you leave. As you enter the house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it's not worthy, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that house or town. Truly I tell you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town.
See, I'm sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of them, for they will hand you over to the councils and flog you in the synagogues. You will be dragged before governors and kings because of me, as a testimony to them and the Gentiles. When they hand you over, do not worry about how you are to speak or what you are to say. For what you are to say will be given to you at that time. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will betray brother to death, and father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all because of my name. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I tell you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes.
The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, I believe Charles is up to offer your opening perspective.
So some
Charles.
perspective, Charles, on what they would have heard, and then as we go into this, I'll ask each of us to mute our communications devices wherever you may be when you're not speaking. Charles, it's all yours, my friend.
Thank you. I want just to say a couple of brief comments about trying to frame the reading of these texts so that I think shift what is likely the understanding that we bring to them. I think most of us sit down or standing up or wherever and read a text like this, and in our head, because without thinking about it, in our head the construct is, well, this was something that was written down almost at the time it was happening. That is, that in this case Matthew, he's named, we think, was taking notes and of life along the way. So as he was writing what was happening here, he had no notion of what was about to happen the next day or the day after that. Now, if you think about it, we all know that's not the way it happened. But our mindset, if we don't think about that, and I think most of the time we sit down and read the gospel, we don't think about that. We don't think about that. We imagine that what we're getting is a pretty close to real-time representation of what happened. And as best scholars can tell, that's not what we're reading. So I just want to put a little stage setting here. What we're reading is a text that was written years after it happened. This text was written after everything had happened, not only the day after the ascension, not only the day after the council at Jerusalem, but years after that. This happened after Paul had made his multiple journeys throughout the Middle East and parts of Europe. And only at that point did the writers of these four Gospels, all four of them, say, well, we need to set up a record of what happened so that people will have it as a whole, complete record. And so, but Matthew was not the first one to do that. Mark was the first one to do that, as far as we can tell. And maybe that's why it's shorter, because he had less to say as he was beginning. But as Matthew and Luke came along, they said, well, yeah, Mark did a good job, but we think we can do a better job. Now, why would they think that? Because they were addressing different audiences. And we don't think about the audiences that they were addressing when we were reading the text. We're thinking about ourselves as being the person being addressed, not who were Mark and Luke and John and Matthew addressing in their Gospels. Those were different groups of people. And so what Matthew and Luke did was to take parts of Mark. They used Mark as the structure. They had another collection of material, which Matthew and Luke shared, which they also used. John was his own individual. That's why it's the Synoptic Gospels plus John, because the Synoptic Gospels follow each other fairly closely. John goes off in his own direction. But they're all records of the same person, the same set of events. But to imagine that we can use them as accurate narratives, tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. They were doing that, but it was a different kind of truth for them than it would be for us, or for Sergeant Jack, I guess his name was. In any case, it's just to say that in Matthew, we have to keep asking ourselves, who was the audience that Matthew was talking to, and how did that enable, why did that require that he do it in a particular way? Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Charles. Well, Bill Hall, I know you've got questions teed up for our discussion. Get us going.
Will do. Thank you, Charles. Again, to set some context, and then I'll offer the three questions, and we'll go back and work on them. This passage from the Gospel of Matthew is a powerful juxtaposing of quiet assurances alongside of monumental challenges. On the one hand, we hear Jesus is promising the disciples the assurance that even in the most difficult and dangerous of circumstances, God will be with them. On the other hand, Jesus forewarns the disciples that there will indeed be risks and dangers in their ministry going forward. In addition, in today's world, there are tensions and challenges for us as we seek to understand how Jesus' instructions to the early disciples are to be lived out by us. That's, in a sense, the point of this podcast is what was said then, how does it inform our lives today. For example, Jesus twice announces that the disciples' commission is to, quote, cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons, end quote. Then Jesus hands the disciples a travel guide that instructs them to give without payment. Jesus instructed the disciples to take no gold or silver or copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics or sandals or a staff, for laborers deserve their food. Whatever town or village you enter, find out who in it is worthy and stay there until you leave, end quote. Yet, another instruction Jesus gives is, see, I am sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Now, it seems to me there are two polar opposite risks that we could face as we seek to understand these ancient words and apply them to ourselves today. We could insist, on the one hand, on a literal and rigid application of the instruction, or we could so spiritualize and soften the words to the point that the clear challenges in them are lost. Wanting to avoid these extremes, I offer the following. In the midst of the current constellation of the crises of the COVID virus, economic dislocation, and racial unrest, one, how do we today, or in what new ways might we embrace and act on Jesus' call to all disciples to be healers no matter what the illness or condition is? And do you hear Jesus demanding that we always succeed in the healing? Second question, how do we today, or in what new ways may we embrace and act on Jesus' call to all disciples to travel without the obvious outward signs of resources? And 3, how do we today, or in what new ways, may we embrace and act on Jesus' call to all disciples to be sheep who are wise and innocent? Now back to question 1, and I will address it first and then my other colleagues. How do we today, or in what new ways, may we embrace and act on Jesus' call to all disciples to be healers no matter what the illness or condition is? And do you hear Jesus demanding that we always succeed in the healing? One cannot argue. One may want to debate whether or not Matthew reported it accurately, but it's clear in this passage. It says more than once that Jesus healed every disease and infirmity, and then he gave the disciples power over impure spirits and to heal every disease and infirmity. Now, it's interesting, the word for heal in Greek is the one from which we get our English word therapy or therapeutic. The Greek word, if I'm pronouncing it right, is therapaneuo, to heal. And according to my Greek English dictionary, one meaning is to serve or do service, and the other is to heal, cure, restore, to help. I like that juxtaposing. It's not just literally healing a disease, it does include that, but it has to do with serving. And I think of Philippians 2, Jesus emptied himself and took on the form of a servant. And this briefly is my take on it. It at least at one level, it's an attitude. Ministers aren't the only one who have all kinds of needs come to their attention. And it's tempting to feel overwhelmed or to try to refer someone somewhere else. And there are times that's appropriate. But that attitude that whatever needs you bring, I can at least seek to serve you. And serving you may mean simply listening to your challenge. So for myself, again, not wanting to spiritualize this and make it so broad that there's no challenge in it, because it is a challenge to listen to people's hurt. And I don't think I need to put a highlighter on how important that is right now. I've read article after article of people saying, there was one from a police chief, we've been meeting with folk for months, and I walk away feeling like we've missed each other. It is not easy to listen to people's pain, but it is so important. So for me, it's an encouragement to be willing to face into with others their challenges. Now, later, there's a story in, I think it's chapter 17, where the disciples did not heal the boy having seizures at the foot of the Mount of Transfiguration, and Jesus rebuked them. Okay. I certainly have not healed everybody that I've worked with. I don't know what to do with that, except that it's a motivation not to shy away from seeking to have a servant's heart. So if I may, Sara, let me hear your take on this.
Thank you, Bill. That's exactly where I landed. The first thing that came to my mind was Micah 6, verse 8. And we use this phrase or this particular passage when the children come up for the children's service. So this is something that I know with music in my head. So what does the Lord require of you? And I thought about how difficult it is to extend loving kindness at all times. And there's some times when I'm just not very loving or kind. And there are times when I could do better. There are times when it just comes out naturally without any good effort on my part. But I think what's important is that we keep trying. So I agree with you that the ways we could embrace or act on Jesus' call in these times in which we're living is to give somebody our attention and to do it with deliberate intentionality. No cell phone on the desk or the table. Listen with your ears and your eyes. Listen with your whole heart if you can. I think one of the things that has happened accidentally, perhaps intentionally, is that we aren't able to give people our whole attention. We reach for our cell phone, or we have the TV on while we're talking, or there's something always happening in the background instead of returning to that notion of, let me give you my whole attention. And for people who measure time in billable 6-second intervals or 6-minute intervals, time is precious. And I think it's valuable to look at somebody when they're talking to you and give them all of your thoughts, all of your attention. Some people may not be comfortable with that. I have a family of introverts that all respond to me very cautiously when I give them my full attention. They're like, am I in trouble? Did I do something wrong? Should I have done something differently? And so I think it's important to know your audience. It's important to be open and prepared, but hesitant to react. So I think that there's some value in that. So one of the things that I discovered is everybody has a base foundation of experience. And if the best parenting experience you've had was brutality or was completely being ignored, you don't have a good baseline to start from. So caring for somebody perhaps like you've been cared for might be a gift. Giving them back their identity or their dignity or a sense of wholeness, or even the perspective of how holy they are, can be a huge gift. I think the reminder I have every day is everybody breathes the same breath of God, which means there's a bit of God in everybody, and I need to see that. I need to look for that. And I need to become comfortable with that. And I think that's part of the walking or gardening or cooking or having coffee with God process that we go through every day. So I'm going to go back to, no, it's not a mandate that I do the curing or that I be successful, because God does the curing. God does the raising of the dead. God does the cleansing of the lepers and the casting out of demons. I must go with courage with him, to bear witness, to endeavor, to gather any supplies that might be needed, and to take on any actions, no matter what they are. Cleaning the bathroom, washing the dishes, prepping dinner, wiping a baby's bottom, changing a diaper. It doesn't matter what the task is. If I go with God, I've got it. That's what I got.
Good.
Don, what about you?
Well said, Don.
I was thinking about our teacher from years back in the lectionary class, Bill Woloff, who passed over 2 years ago. And I would ask anybody listening to think about who has talked to you about healing, who has talked to you about venturing out, experiencing suffering, seeing suffering. And he said, God always calls for a purpose. And I would overwrite that with saying, and not just belong, not to be in an enclave, not to be in isolation. And he also said, remember, there's not a hint of these people having special skills to do this work. And it jumped out at me. That on the subject of competency to deal with healing and care, there may be a nod now and then toward one disciple or two, particularly one. But there's no specific competency here to do this work at all. So it requires a special, Sara, to your point, listening and end breaking. And in a passage that follows this, dedication to making sure that you don't venture out with fear so that you can see. That you need to remove the fear so you can do these things. Bill, your question about, I think it was having to do with success, the success of healing, the failure of healing. I'll put out for discussion, I think Jesus, for success, expects full engagement in the business of healing. So if you're facilitating a class this week, raise with the class a comparison to a profession. If you're a bricklayer, an engineer, a dentist, an attorney, whatever a farmer, whatever your pursuit would be, what does it take to be successful in that pursuit? And in the case of healing, which is the highest of callings, because I think what Jesus is looking for is restoration. Usually healing goes with restoring to the community. You're healed, you can go back. You healed, you can add more value to the community. You can move through it with love. I think that's a big part of it. That it's not my responsibility. It's not success of healing. It's success in the pursuit of the profession of healing, and that everyone is called to be in the business of healing. And so here's an instruction book. And so I'll pick up on that when we start talking about what do you carry when you venture out? How does that work? How are you near to the people that you see as you travel or as you go about your day? Well, it's being in the profession of healing. So Bill, that's my best shot at it.
Good, thank you. And listening to you, I remember that Paul prayed that he would have his thorn in the flesh removed, and it never was. So he wasn't healed. Thank you. Now, number two. Can
I come in just a minute? May I come in just a minute?
Sure,
please.
I sit here wondering about this. When Jesus was healing people, when Jesus touched people, he didn't have a kind of therapeutic conversation with people. When the woman who had a flow came and touched him, she was not looking for a conversation about how she felt and about how her life was. She just wanted to be healed. And Jesus, with some exceptions, didn't have long therapeutic conversations. He wasn't a psychiatrist. He wasn't a psychologist. He was a healer. And he healed people. He didn't make them feel better about being how they were. He fixed them. And what his disciples did was to go out and they fixed people. Every now and then they failed, but for the most part, when they came back, what they reported was they went out and people got over what they had. They were healed. And that's a capacity, that's a gift, which was apparently not taken for granted in that time, but was recognized and was exercised. But it did, for some reason, it didn't seem to last. The number of healings that have occurred since then has been very, very small, and I just raise that as a puzzle. I have no accounting for it. It does make a difference when you can empathize with people, when you can care for them. But what Jesus is not talking about empathy, he's not talking about caring, he's talking about making it right. And that's what he did. And that's what he required, that's the task that he laid upon his disciples. And that's what they, for the most part, they went out and did, and they came back and reported success. Not that they listened to people, not that people felt better about themselves when they finished the conversation, that they were healed. But this is early in the story. They don't continue. They don't spread out through the rest of Galilee and the rest of Judea. After that, they come back and they spend the rest of the story walking with Jesus as he performs these miracles. And I don't have an answer for my question. I just have a puzzle that I'm setting out that I'm now recognizing for the first time in my 82 years.
Okay. Thank you, Charles. Question number 2, and Sarah, I'll go to you first. How do we today, or in what new ways, may we embrace and act on Jesus' call, this is my paraphrase, to all disciples to travel without the obvious outward signs of resources? Sarah?
Sometimes it's important to leave space for someone else to fill in the gap. If you travel light and it's obvious you don't have resources, it's it invites people to fill in the missing elements. I'm thinking of the story Stone Soup that seems to be a universal story in multiple cultures. This idea of people entering a community and assembling a soup, starting with something as simple as rocks in a large cauldron and water, and then adding elements to the soup based upon what people have in abundance. But to get started, people have to be asked, well, what would be good in this soup? Well, I have some mushrooms, or I have some carrot, or I have some celery, or I have some cabbage. And it starts with small additives that come in from the community, but first there has to be the vacuum. There has to be a gap. So I think the instruction from Jesus to travel without obvious elements that would be considered a protective weapon, like a staff, an extra tunic for warmth, engages or leaves open for opportunity to have a community engage. And there's something about being actively vulnerable and being willing to be actively vulnerable, to engage other participants to assist. And as a human, I'm not good at that. I'm really not good at that. I'd rather have covered all my bases, walk in with no needs, and be prepared to leave without forcing somebody else to cover or to protect me. And, I'm the middle of two brothers. So, growing up, it was pretty much you had to have some moxie to stand next to those boys and not get covered or walloped. So I think that the walk or the gardening process with God invites us to consider the gift of vulnerability to each other, and to be teachable, to be engaged and active, to be listening, to be agile, to be ready. What about you, Don?
Well, I'm excited about this one because traveling light and traveling in the context of places and cultures are some of my favorite subjects in Scripture and my favorite subjects in global literature. And I think this subject can go on and on and on in discussion, and I think that makes it rich and important, just like the travels of the disciples, and to this day, travels across the planet and now into space, as we launched a manned vehicle just a few days ago, go on and on and on. And if you're facilitating a class, because I know folks listen in to think about how do you ask questions, how do you facilitate a group, this one is the most powerful. Traveling light always works. And I know this from experience. Ask the question, what is it like to travel light? Why do you travel light? It's almost as if the gospel flows into it and all the responses kind of write themselves, layers of meaning. The breakthroughs that can take place in a class are great. And the questions we could ask a group of children work very well too. It doesn't matter what your age, what your experience is. We know how to talk about traveling light in terms of place and culture. And there's a gospel. I think the gospel is in every answer. And I just want to give you a few examples. I used to just give 2 answers. Now I could give 20 or 30. So I guess what I'm saying is if you're facilitating patience, you don't have to say a whole lot. Write them down, mark them. The gospel will be there. Here's some examples. Traveling light means the signs of resources are not there when people see you or greet you as you go into a new place. There's a scarcity of resources when considered as the days of the journey pass. That's powerful on its own. Under-resourced. Number 2, traveling light demands a practicality of living and any kind of discipline. What you see, where are you? What is the community where you pass? If you're traveling light, you can see. And Sarah, that goes along with some of the points you were making. The delivery of the basic sustaining needs is shaped not by you, the traveler, but by the host. As the guest, you dine like they dine. You abide in their culture, And even I'd say if you recognize the food that's put in front of you in a new town, a new place, you may recognize it, but you still have to learn their symbolic language to describe that thing that you're dining on. And you say thanks for it in their language. Another might be extra resources or plentiful resources are distractions when you travel. The things that you have to be tended to. I overpack. I'm an overpacker. When I venture out, I travel all the time before pandemic, and I plan to after the pandemic. I spend more time worrying about all those things I take with me. It makes me the subject. It makes the objects the subject. It makes me putting in a sense of protection and defensiveness. I don't want them to be stolen. I don't want them to be lost. What does that do to my point of view? What does that do to me as I travel or abide with other people? Extra resources also imply fear and defensiveness and paranoia. It takes our eyes off what we need to be looking at. And if the loss of the plenty gives this idea of vulnerability, then there's a loss of freedom in it. So you're tied to it. If you lose it, there's a sense of loss of freedom. And I think what Jesus is talking about is being liberated. And then finally, plenty and extra goods does create an identity. No matter what, whatever's on our body, whatever we carry with us, there's an identity. We need certain things. We probably need sandals to be walking. We need some food for the day. We may need something over our heads, or whatever it might be for where we're going. But the extra things, the animals, the costumes, the extra wealth, the extra food. You walk into a village, people want to pigeonhole you. We want to pigeonhole them. It makes it a little easier to approach your brother and sister, a little easier for you to approach them because you probably have needs, because I have nothing to eat tomorrow. And you need to dine on their culture. You need to dine on their way of expressing themselves. Just a few examples. So my message to anyone that's teaching or facilitating is just ask the question, and the gospel will flow out in traveling light all day long. That's my best answer, Bill.
Good. Thank you.
Can I make a couple of off-the-wall comments?
Sure.
This would have been about 60 years ago, when I set out from the United States to go to Lebanon to be a short-term missionary for 3 years. I remember that I had one large suitcase that I was able to take with me on the plane, and I was allowed to send 2 other packages that would contain the rest of my contents that I would need for the rest of the 3 years that I was going to be there. Each of those boxes was about a foot and a half long by about 6 inches high and about a foot and a half wide. And that was it. When my wife and I, not my wife at that point, but my to-be wife, we came back through Europe together when my tour was up 3 years later, and she had been a student at the college there. But when we set out from Beirut to travel for a month and a half before we flew back to the United States, we had a backpack. I mean, not a giant backpack. We had small backpacks. That was all we had for that 6 month of that 6 week period of traveling by foot, by train, by hitchhiking, by bus, by boat throughout Europe, and finally taking off from somewhere in England, Glasgow. No, I guess London. It was London or Glasgow we flew back from, but it was just, and it's not done that way anymore. When I think about what it's taken me to get ready to move to Minnesota, it's an entirely different question.
Good. Thank you, Charles. And I will just quickly add, I think I said this last week, another way in which we can travel light in this season of pandemic, and this Zoom is an example of it, is that we are enabled to discover anew what is really essential. And the quote that someone else came up with that I referenced last week, the church is never closed. We are able to rediscover. This is about relationship. There's a different way of doing house church now than there was in the early days of the spread of the gospel. And I think that's freeing, that we are grateful for the buildings, but ultimately, Don, to your idea of the gospel flowing, the gospel isn't building big buildings. The gospel is being in relationship with God and others. All right, the third question, and Don, I'll go to you first and then Sara. How do we today, or in what new ways, may we embrace and act on Jesus' call to all disciples to be sheep who are wise and innocent? Don.
This is a challenge, and I had a snake on my lanai 2 days ago as I was preparing for this podcast. I thought, all right, now here's the snake. Let's consider the snake. And I could hear Charles Willard going, well, be careful, Don. It's not the first century. Be careful what you consider a snake. But there was the snake. And for folks that might be looking at our little studio in the Zoom, I'll give you a sense of what I mean by that. Look at the green world we live in. And what I'm doing on the podcast is just pointing out a window because I live in Florida, and it's steamy and green, and it's filled with snakes. Where I live is filled with snakes, and so the temptation is to go there and think about it. But I'm not going to go all the way with it. I'm just going to talk about the power of these metaphors on their own, the fact that they are strange metaphors. And I think a strange metaphor combination means something on its own. That those two metaphors, as odd as they are, need each other. They're there for the disciples to be successful. And he doesn't say be a snake and be a lamb. He says have these attributes. So you don't be confused by the metaphor if it isn't working for you. But look at the strangeness. The strange metaphors for average human beings, snake and a lamb. For your everyday person venturing out, a snake and a lamb. Isn't that strange? So consider the strangeness. The weirdness of the combination, I think, is a signal of something new. If it's hard to wrap your head around it, think about that. Maybe do these disciples recognize themselves? They think on ahead. And I would add Paul to this mix down the road. You recognize yourselves in a new age of travel as a follower of the way. And I think this is also suggesting something new and strange here. And maybe when you walk into the village carrying light, maybe you are a new creature. Maybe something different going on here. So it's not only an instruction, it's not only like a rule book of what is the discipline of your travels going forward, but it's a reminder that there is really different thinking and behaviors as they venture out. That this is a signal that the new creatures are quite strange. And it reminded me of my oldest daughter, whose name is Susan. Sometimes at night, towards the end of the day, we might be reading a book, but we ask each other questions as if they made sense. It was strange. She'd say, Dad, what is trees plus chickens plus 173? It's nonsense. And I'd say, She goes, so what's the answer? And she goes, well, the answer is a bracelet with feathers. Nonsense. But she was so passionate about it. I said, well, that's great. What is bricks plus 2 million plus lemons? And we'd answer the question with great confidence with something silly. So I wanted to just throw that out to say and it was magical, it was poetic. And sometimes little truths came into it as well. So I'm not going to go there in terms of exactly what this means to the discipline. I'm just going to stop at the strangeness of this metaphor and maybe a signal that life beyond, life in the following of the way is so strange. The life of compassion, the life of healing and restoration is so strange. Don't think that you just pick up and start with it. It takes this kind of rule book to move forward with it. At least that's what I learned in this world full of snakes that I have out here. How about you, Sara?
Okay, so I'm an over-preparer. My confession. I'd like to prepare for every inevitable possibility and have the resources at hand to respond. And I don't know what need is going to present itself, but I want to be prepared. I think that's the mom gene that comes out. Like, we need to pack a toy, we need to pack a book, we need to pack some snacks, we need to pack water, we need to pack a change of clothes, we need to pack our insurance card, we need to pack. I'm thinking along those lines, and I forget that the most important thing is to listen. And so this idea of not cloaking the people I see with my expectations, not cloaking my perceptions on people so I can anticipate what they're going to need. I haven't even met them. So I called this, when we catastrophize, making up new words, when we create a catastrophe in the future and respond to it, and it never occurs. I think this is something that we grow through. I'm watching a teenager now going through this, and the word catastrophizing comes up a lot in our house, and I go, wait, that hasn't even happened yet. Maybe it's not gonna. So I went back to a phrase that my friend Charles shared with me that I made notes on because I just love this. Always make the better assumption. And so when we look for and we act on our better angel, the instruction of our better angel, so to speak, to lift a Bill Hull, when we pursue the kingdom of heaven here and now, we have what we need. And so I think that that's a wonderful starting point. So walking out with wisdom or with a guileless perspective, and I don't know how to do that in some cases, we make the better assumption that people will be helpful. We make the better assumption that people will supply the things we need. My mother used to say, we have a credit card, we can get anything we need. Don't worry about it. I go, but Mom, we need to pay the bills. And so I think this sounds good on the face of it, but it's very difficult because we are driven by fear. We are creatures that are afraid most of the time, and we address our fear by covering that anxiety with a supply of resources. So we assume the worst, we imagine catastrophe, we self-direct and want to reimagine a new future that we can prevent whatever the catastrophe is. And I think that's a worshiping at a different idol experience. And I think that when we walk into those places, fear is what gives us paralysis. And I thought about Peter walking on water, and it's like as long as we aren't paying attention to that which we are fearful of, we can walk on the water. And it's when we start to pay attention to things that we are afraid of that we lose our effectiveness. And this is where the grace comes in, because then it shatters this self-built cage of illusion that I've constructed, and it reminds me that I'm built from stars, that I carry the breath of God in me, and it's by that will and that purpose that I exist. So, wisdom and innocence. Oh, thanks, Charles.
All right. Were you finished, Sarah? Sorry.
I am.
Okay. I will add briefly a note that was suggested to me by reading this passage in the Message by Eugene Peterson. Let me read you how he translates this. Stay alert. This is hazardous work I'm assigning you. You're going to be like sheep running through a pack of wolves. So don't call attention to yourselves. Be as cunning as a snake, inoffensive as a dove. What that suggests to me is, and this may sound a little strange, we're called to be discerning, but in particular to be aware there are wolves. we tend to put a very positive spin on this, which is attractive and real. But as strange as it may seem, in my journey, I've had trouble recognizing wolves. And I mean that metaphorically, but real. I've been way too trusting at times, to my detriment and others. Now, that doesn't mean I think I've got perfect discernment, and the Bible makes a lot, especially the New Testament, of being discern the spirits. Don't take everything at face value. So the ability, along with, yes, Sarah, the light of God is in all of us. I love the Quaker emphasis on that God's light is in every person, even the most flawed of us. Amen. But that doesn't mean we follow that light, and none of us follow it perfectly. So there are wolves. And what it says to me in this season of pandemic and racial strife is it is especially important that our leaders and we carefully weigh the options and changes that may be forthcoming. A lot of immediate solutions are being offered and in some ways insisted on. I hear that pain and the yearning behind it, but careful weighing. And we've gotten into this mess because we've not carefully weighed the implications. For example, that this nation has yet to come to grips with the issue of slavery. Our founders avoided it in the original Constitution, and we've yet to be discerning about what constitutes justice. So, friends, they're wolves, and we're supposed to be lambs in the midst of them. All right, Don, back to you. Thank you, folks.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. And just want to hold up the forming of great questions for those of you that listen in to prepare for classes in moderation. That's where the action is. The right question leads to great conversations and learning over the years and change. So commend that to you. And Charles Willard, let me turn to you to see if you have a summary or a synthesis of what we've been talking about. Looking forward to your remarks.
Briefly, once again, you all have demonstrated, we, include myself, we have demonstrated the capacity of four individuals to bring completely different points of view together in what I will describe as an experience of wonder and charm and grace. And I think if I were looking at this strictly through the lens of a biblical scholar, I would say, well, there wasn't much going on there. But from a point of view of which I'm also technically at least a pastor and a bearer of the good news and a hearer and an experiencer of the good news, what's been demonstrated here is the capacity of God's will and God's blessing and God's insight to be enlarged and shared in a way that nobody would have been able to anticipate 60 minutes ago. And the remarkable thing is it happens over and over again. And I want to thank you for that, and to remind those who are watching this for the first time, or maybe the second or fifth time, that, this is not an accident. It happens all the time. We just have to be prepared to acknowledge and recognize and be thankful for that, as I am. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Just want to go and see if there's any quick wrap-up. Bill Hull, you good to go?
I'm good to go. Thank you.
How about you, Sara Mickelson?
I'm ready.
Great. Thank you. Well, for folks listening in, Palmacia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose. That's in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's maceia.org. And at that site, you'll find lots of resources, lots of ways to connect. And during the time of pandemic, lockdown, or if you're just spending time and trying to work on something, it's got many resources, from sermons, reflections, prayers, other discussions of this text as well. So we commend that to you. And you're always welcome, and we'll see you next time.